So I'm here to talk about another socially important issue in a time where governments are increasingly demanding access to encrypted data or seeking to nullify the protection of encryption. We want to protect access to encryption to allow people to continue to protect their data. I'll start off by apologizing. I feel like I'm a little underdressed for the topic. I was actually going to try to borrow a suit for my talk, but I couldn't get in touch with this guy in time before the conference. Why am I standing up here and really wishing I had this suit from the Hurt Locker? Well, I'm here to bring you a very radical proposal. I'm here to suggest to you that we might actually want to make our crypto a little bit weaker. Normally we talk about how do we make crypto stronger. We might actually want to make it a little bit weaker so that we can make our systems stronger and provide stronger protection to our users. Now, I'll admit, the authors of this work, we ourselves are a bit ambivalent about the idea. But if you'll bear with me for the next 18 or 19 minutes, I think we have the potential here to do a lot of good. So let's see what you think. The most famous case of a government demanding access to encrypted data is Apple versus the FBI. I'm sure you all know this story. In 2015, after the San Bernardino terror attacks, the FBI, under the direction of James Comey, demanded that Apple help them decrypt an iPhone that at one time belonged to one of the attackers. Apple, under Tim Cook, of course, said no. And there was a big fight in the courts and in the court of public opinion and the press, and this dragged on. And it got to the point where Apple engineers were openly discussing the idea, maybe we're gonna go to jail rather than help the FBI with this. And the reason they were having to have this tough discussion was that if they provided this special code, this effectively a backdoor to the FBI, it could have been used not only to get into that one iPhone that was supposedly important for the case, but it also could have been used to get into thousands or maybe millions of other devices that maybe weren't as important. And I'm here to propose to you that it's a limitation of the technology that forces this debate into a false dichotomy. If you read news articles about this topic, you go read on Twitter about this topic, the view that you get is that we have a strict binary choice between these two absolutist options. If you listen to Jim Comey or Rod Rosenstein at the Department of Justice and FBI, if we continue with strong encryption like we have now, we're gonna get into this future where internet hooligans like this guy in the Guy Fawkes mask are running around harassing people, causing chaos, and terrorists and criminals are doing their thing with basically nobody able to stop them. On the other hand, if you listen to people on our side tell it, our only alternative to that is to give in to a government that wants access to all our data all the time and wants to be all powerful like the agents from the movie The Matrix. Now, obviously, these are caricatures, right? Tim Cook is not really running around out there in a Guy Fawkes mask. Jim Comey and Rod Rosenstein don't really want to be Agent Smith, but the state of the public debate on this isn't a whole lot more nuanced than that. I'm here to argue to you that if those two alternatives are all we give people, we may not like the way it turns out. I like this XKCD cartoon because it reminds us that the security of a real system doesn't just depend on the technology. It depends on the human factors too. And I'm not too worried about Agent Smith running around with a wrench, hitting every owner of an encrypted device, but I am a little worried about the pressure that can be applied to the device makers. And we don't have to go too far back in history to see examples where this has happened. Back in 2013, we had two encrypted email providers, LavaBit and Silent Circle. They both shut down after a court order came down for LavaBit, where they were gonna have to turn over a master cryptographic key that would have exposed all of their users' encrypted data to the feds. If you go back a couple years before that, BlackBerry was almost kicked out of India in 2010 until they caved in and they gave the government a backdoor. When we look around the world, we see that right now, the situation is maybe even a little bit worse already. This chart comes from a tech report last year from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. They looked at laws around the world and they found that right now, about half of people alive today live under governments where, at least officially on the books, there are laws that say that you must provide some sort of assistance to recover encrypted data, whether that's key escrow or backdoors or whatever. And what may be surprising to us as technologists is that it's not only authoritarian oppressive governments that are imposing these requirements. This stuff is pretty popular sometimes. So here I have some survey data from Pew from 2014. They asked Americans, what do you think? Should it be possible for people to do some activities online with anonymity? And the results are kind of mixed. When you look between sexes, between age ranges, between income levels. On the whole, though, we see that Americans think privacy is important. But it's not nearly as sacrosanct as it is within our tech filter bubble. And you can look at some of these demographic results. And for example, among women, it's only a minority of women who believe that online anonymity is really important. As another example, I have some data here from YouGov in the UK. This is from 2015. They asked people about what's the right balance between privacy and security. And I'll note here, when they say security, they're not talking about data security or information security. They're talking about more like national security or maybe physical safety. And again, we see that privacy is important to people, but physical safety is even more important. And this result holds, for the most part, across party affiliation. And so I'm here to argue that if all we're going to give people, if we're going to give the public policy people, if we're going to give the voting public only a stark choice between these two extreme options, that sounds to me like a high-stakes gamble. We might as well go to Vegas and put it all on black. There's a huge risk that the strategy winds up losing everything and we wind up in that Agent Smith future. So my first call to action in my talk is that we need to kind of give ourselves permission to work on this problem, to think about other approaches, to get out of this low resolution, one bit of precision, binary all or nothing world. So wouldn't it be nice, instead of that stark binary choice, if we had more like a sliding scale or a continuum? And so you can imagine, wouldn't it be cool if we could decide exactly what level of access we wanted to allow, and we could turn a knob or move a slider? And so maybe at the far left end of the spectrum, we would allow access for the government to recover encrypted data only in the most important, like existential threat kind of cases. So the 9/11 hijackers or the KKK or whoever we think is the biggest threat, that's the only cases we would allow. As we slide that slider towards the other end, we might allow more and more access in less and less serious cases, to the point where maybe at some point we're allowing access to encrypted data for any case where right now prosecutors and investigators can get a search warrant with probable cause. And so in this model, we can imagine that even organizations that have really strong feelings about this, for example, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the FBI, even they wouldn't be at these absolute extremes. I'm going to get in a ton of trouble with this slide, right? Because I'm kind of putting words into the mouth of the FBI and the EFF. Ooh, sorry, guys. But you'll notice that there's no scale on my graph here, right? And that's intentional. It's a little hand wavy, but hopefully you see the point. And I think taking that even further, most normal people would probably fall somewhere in the middle, and probably closer together than we might think from the state of the current debate. So we have a lot more in common than we think. And again, it's a failure of the technology that it takes people who are so close and it pushes us apart to these extreme options that nobody would really pick if we had our choice. Okay, so how do we do better? Well, if we're gonna try, I'll argue that there's at least 3 key requirements that we need to satisfy for anything to work. First and foremost, we absolutely need to have the strongest protections against warrantless mass surveillance. This is one of the cases where older approaches for this problem, like key escrow from the 1990s, they fail. So in key escrow, the idea is that every decryption key gets encrypted and wrapped up and sent off to the authorities or to some trusted intermediary. But there's nothing to prevent that authority from going and opening up all the keys and using them to listen in on all the messages. And so we need to avoid that if we're gonna make something work at all in this case. Secondly, we need to make our technology easy and efficient for the people who are gonna use it and for the people that are gonna develop it and build out the systems. This is another place where key escrow fails. It doesn't make a lot of sense for me as an end user to burn through my battery and burn through my data plan, encrypting and sending off all these encrypted keys, when the benefit isn't for me, directly anyway, it's really for Jim Comey or the FBI. So our third requirement, once we've satisfied the first two, we can start to talk about enabling some truly limited access in exceptional circumstances. We call this problem exceptional access. It should stay the exception rather than the norm. And of course, we also need to have built-in technological safeguards to keep it rare, and we need to have strong incentives to require due process and protect against misuse. So today I have some early preliminary cryptographic constructions that can get us toward this future. This is probably not the greatest be-all, end-all final construction that we can come up with, so this is my second call to action. I want to see what this community can do to push this area forward. But today, the approach that I want to present is that think about, so car metaphors are always terrible, right? But here's my car metaphor. Sometimes when something really bad happens, it's better to sacrifice the technology and have the machine break a little bit in order to protect the people inside. And so let's go back to that example where the feds have two options for getting this guy's decryption key. They've got the $5 wrench and they've got the $1 million cluster. Suddenly that $1 million cluster doesn't sound so bad, does it? For one thing, it's gonna hurt a lot less when they use it. And secondly, it costs a lot, so it has a built-in disincentive for misuse. And so let's try to take this idea and make this a little more precise and a little more general. So for one thing, maybe $1 million isn't enough, and paying that cost just once isn't enough. So what we want to do is we want to impose two separate kinds of costs on any adversary that wants to recover our messages. We're going to have an initial upfront cost that you have to pay before you can recover any messages at all. We're going to call this capital I. And then we're going to have a marginal cost that you have to pay each time you want to decrypt a new message. So we're going to call this capital M. And the idea is that we can tune capital M, we can make it really high to limit the number of messages that can be decrypted. We can turn it down to enable more. Here we're going to rely on a slightly non-standard set of cryptographic assumptions. Normally we assume that everybody is maximally malicious and our adversaries are going to screw us over no matter what the cost of themselves. Here we're relying on the rational crypto approach, where we assume that all parties act out of rational self-interest. So for us, that means that even if somebody has the money and the time and the resources to recover a key and decrypt a message, they're not necessarily going to do it unless the benefit they get from that message outweighs the cost of all the expenditure they had to do to recover the key. To impose our initial cost, we're going to repurpose an attack on Diffie-Hellman key exchange. I don't have time to get into all the math of Diffie-Hellman here, but in that key exchange, it works by both parties who want to exchange key. We'll do some modular math with really big numbers, modulo a big prime P. The insight from this paper from 2015 was that attacking this construction can be broken down into a really big upfront pre-computation phase, shown in the yellow part of the diagram. And they estimate that for a 1024-bit prime, this would cost about $145 million. But then once the adversary has paid this cost, they can go and break any Diffie-Hellman key exchange that uses the prime P for a relatively small cost. This is the part shown in pink. So we are going to repurpose this attack, and we're going to use it for something good. The idea is that we can take this pre-computation, and we can use this as an extremely expensive puzzle, and we can crank up the difficulty and the cost of it by changing the length of the prime P. So how much does it cost? Well, it's hard to say for sure because the attack is really complicated and there's a lot of different pieces of the algorithm that you can trade off against each other. But we took the numbers and the analysis from that 2015 paper and we extrapolated out to primes larger than 1024 bits. And it looks like if we set P to be between 1070 and 1090 bits, we can have a pre-computation attack that costs between $1 and $2 billion. It's, again, billion with a B. So at that level, it doesn't really matter who your adversary is. That's a pretty substantial cost before you can recover even a single message. Just for comparison, I think the FBI's annual budget this year is about $10 billion, 9 point something. So pretty substantial. For our marginal costs, we're going to use a hash-based proof of work similar to Hashcash or more famously in Bitcoin mining. So we're going to assume that the original application did a good job of deriving a good symmetric key. We're going to call that K0, KO. The first thing we do is we take what we call the little hash function, little h, we pass KO through little h, and that gives us a string of random bits that's substantially shorter than in the original key. And then we take that, we pack it up together with some public metadata about the message or about the file or about whatever we're encrypting, including, if possible, if we have the Diffie-Hellman key exchange going on as well, we include the shared secret SW from that weak Diffie-Hellman key exchange. And we pass all of that through another hash function, big H, that gives us a string of random looking bits that is the same size as the original key. And we can just plug that back into the original app and use that in place of the original key. And so now, to recover the message, all the adversary needs to do is a brute force search. They don't need to find the original KO. They need to find the hash, the little h of KO. So for example, if little h gives us 60 bits, then that's a key space of only 2 to the 60 that they need to search. And to make it easier to predict how much that brute force search is going to cost, we borrow some important parameters from Bitcoin. So in Bitcoin mining, what you do is you do a brute force search over a random number in a header that's 80 bytes or 640 bits. And so we make our header the same size. And the hash function that in Bitcoin mining that they're computing is a double SHA-256. So you take a SHA-256 hash of the header, and then you hash that hash again, and that's your output, and we use that as our crumpled key. How much does that cost? Well, it depends on the hardware that you're using to do the search. And here we have some data from the Bitcoin wiki to show the enormous difference in energy performance for custom ASIC hardware that's been developed specifically for Bitcoin versus, say, a recent top-of-the-line Intel CPU. We're looking at a 20,000 times difference. So the important takeaway for us is that even if we have a nation-state adversary, the chance that they could come up with something that's vastly better than this is pretty small, right? It's very difficult for them to outrun what the free market can already do. Okay, so again, how much does it cost? Well, we took some data from the US Energy Information Agency. It looks like the cheapest region of the US, you pay about 5.2 cents per kilowatt hour. And so we plug that in with our mining efficiency, and the relationship is pretty simple, right? So you add 1 bit to the key length, you double the search cost. And note here that the y-axis on this graph is logarithmic, and I guess if you think of the x-axis as the size of the key space, that's also logarithmic. And I'm not here to tell you what the right choice of the key length is, but it looks like the range between maybe 60 and 80 bits is probably the right area to be looking. So if you have this high-performance, efficient ASIC miner, and you have a key space of 2 to the 60, then it looks like you can do that search for about $1,000. If we crank up the effective key length to 70 bits, that goes up to $1 million. We crank it up again to 80 bits, now we're talking about $1 billion. Again, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, pretty soon you're talking real money. So that's sort of the initial constructions that we have for this. I don't want to claim that this is a solved problem now, but I hope this is enough to get the debate started and to have a more productive, more nuanced, more thoughtful debate on this topic. So for example, now we can think about if we have more choices than just this binary extremes, where do we want to set that slider? How much access do we want to allow? Even if the answer is none, that's very different when we say, no, we will not do this. It's different from, oh, sorry, we can't. And so it's qualitatively different. There are also some technical challenges here. I may skip through this a little quickly. For one thing, there are certain targets, certain people, whose information is probably always worth it for the adversaries to go after. What should we do to help them? Should we? Can we? I think that's an important area for future work. As another thing, the math behind this Diffie-Hellman attack is not something that the world really understands very well yet, and we need to get a better handle on that. I showed you a puzzle that I think costs about $2 billion. What if it's not $2 billion? What if it's 100 million or just a couple of million? Finally, there's some regimes that we probably should not ever trust with a scheme like this, because they would just, whatever it takes, they're going to crack down on the dissidents, even if that means criminals go free and their people starve. Finally, you can imagine if we were to deploy a system like this, that world governments would probably collaborate and work together to solve some of these big problems. And I don't know, is that something that we want to encourage? And if so, how do we do it? Is it something we want to discourage? And if so, how? Before I wrap up, I want to come back to Apple versus the FBI. For the people now in Jim Comey's role, I want to caution you that pushing for a mandate for something like this before we have time to do more research and better understand the risks would be a really, really bad idea, really very premature. On the other hand, if you're in Tim Cook's role, and I think probably more of us are in that role, hopefully we've given you some ideas that you can use. If you're worried about a government coming and demanding access to your users' encrypted data, maybe you could do something proactively to protect yourself and to protect your users before we have another San Bernardino. My co-author and I are happy to meet with anybody in industry or government if you want to talk about these problems more. I think we have some time for questions and discussion. Remember, I forgot my suit, so go easy on me, but looking forward to it. Thank you.